All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I'm here with Quentin, fan of reading and knowledge in general, a good friend of mine,
Reading
and
and stuff.
general human code. And we're here to talk about praising confusion. I think many times there's a sense that when we read a book, we're supposed to understand it, and that if we don't understand it, we're imbeciles. That if we read a book and we think about it and have a different take, then we might be wrong. And that our opinions somehow need to tend towards some authority, whether it's a teacher, a critic, the general consensus, people commenting on BookTube, or BookTubers telling us how to think about this. But that doesn't have to be why we read, and that doesn't have to be how we read. So Quentin and I have been messaging about this back and forth, and we had a few thoughts we'd like to discuss, and of course chime in the comments and share your thoughts as well. So Quentin, I started thinking about this because I was realizing that students I was talking to felt like they were compelled to respond to questions a certain way, that there's a correct answer of, when asked about the theme of a work or the symbolism of a work. And I started to realize how formulaic a lot of English education can be, and in a sense, reading can be, reading for pleasure as adults. So was there a time as you, in your journey as a reader or as an educator, future educator, where you felt compelled to understand so much so that you were strictly reading for comprehension? You were trying to like pick out these Easter egg crumbs that were in the text that some authority figure had laid out for you. And you were so focused on that you realized you weren't enjoying the work at all.
Yes, I think so for sure. But the thing is, for a while before, I noticed this especially when I went to, before I came to university. Because before I came, I had this idea, oh, I'm going there. I'm gonna start really learning about stuff. So I would sort of obsess about getting works. And I think that was more in anticipation of what was coming than what I had been through. Although what I've been through before that, in terms of schooling, was more about reading comprehension.
Right.
You know what I mean? But mostly it had to do with poetry. I would mostly feel it with poetry when I'm trying to nail down every possible interpretation for something. Yeah, yeah. And then I read John Ashbery. So, that kind of drove me insane a little bit. But yeah, you can just appreciate the complexity to things instead of having to nail down the the specifics of everything, I guess.
It was not planned for me to post a video on John Ashbury's first collection this past week for you to say that,
Yeah, yeah.
but he was an eye opener for me as well. I definitely remember. I remember when I was really young being told, "Here's what this poem means. Here's how we know it." Not because the writer sat down and wrote out, "This is what this poem means," but we were told, "This is exactly what this poem means, and here's what this symbol means, and here's why this piece is mentioned in there, and that's exactly what it means, and you need to now write that in a sense. Copy my thought about this poem. Everybody copy my thought. I'm going to start the sentence and start the paragraph, and now you're going to find two more pieces of evidence in there that confirm that I'm correct as the authority figure."
Yeah, and there's not much thought about what to do with the interpretation once you've made it. It's like, oh, now you've got it, and then what? Which is where most of the literary analysis that I'm exposed to in school now, most of it goes with the so what of the interpretation. But I remember reading Fire and Ice by Robert Frost, and our teacher, I think it was like grade 9 or something, explained, nope, this is what everything means, and then just closed the doors. And I'm like, now where do I go? And the whole class was like, we appreciated it, but you know, there was more to it.
Oh, 100%. And I think, to use a hiking analogy, it's a little bit like you climb these mountains and there's this incredible vista that you is suddenly opening before you, and you've suddenly cleared a tree line or something. You're experiencing something new, and then immediately it's like, okay, everybody get your water, turn around, we're going to head back down now. Okay, the bell's going to ring in 12 minutes, so let's get this done. Let's hurry back down the trail now, everybody, come on. And there's it's like, but I was connecting with that. There was a feeling I was getting, and I don't know what that feeling is. I don't know how to articulate it, and I don't have time to, because I now have to copy the sentence about what Frost's poem about the road not taken means, and apply that immediately to my life. When did you take the road not taken? Things like that. Give an
Yeah,
example.
exactly.
but I
Exactly.
definitely
Yeah.
remember it. I definitely remember it. Poetry was what I actually wrote down. I was trying to come up with examples of when I thought about this, and I was like, oh, it was definitely poetry, and being told just that, or these poems mean these things, and if you don't understand that, you're not paying close enough attention. What are you doing? And the flip side though was I remember a couple of times where we actually just read something, and it was sort of like we were being challenged. And so if you could get anything out of it, the expectation was so low that it was, if you get anything out of this, that's amazing. And so I remember reading Shakespeare. I had a teacher who she was moving at the end of the year when I was 13. And I was 13, and she was moving at the end of the year. And so she just decided in the spring, like, we're just going to do whatever she wants to do. And she's teaching a group of 13-year-olds. And so she goes, she printed out these copies of like Macbeth. And she was like, we're just going to read this out loud. Everybody's going to get a couple of parts, if you have small ones, we're just going to read this out loud. And we got so into it. There were girls who were like bringing in makeup to like make themselves look like witches or like wounds and
That's
stuff.
cool.
This wasn't a theater class. It was just somebody
Just
who
for
didn't
fun.
really give a darn because there was nothing to lose, giving us a chance to really interact with Shakespeare. And I didn't get all the language. I didn't get all of the symbolism. It was way above my head, but I remember really enjoying it and having a lot of fun. And we had so much fun. We did Hamlet next, and it was guys who played on the tackle football team, uh, shouting at each other as Hamlet and Laertes, having a ball and being like, whoa, like this guy rocks. Like I love this. This is what I'm all about. I want to read more of this. And then the next year, I was like, okay, Romeo and Juliet, and here's what this symbolism means. And like, we need to talk about this thing. Mercutio's just crazy. He's probably like maybe using some drugs or something. So we're just not even going to talk about his long poem. None of you are going to understand that. But everybody get this down, get this down. And so it was sort of this flip side of being exposed to something like Shakespeare where there were no expectations. It was sort of just all bets are off and just loving it.
And that's kind of how literature should be. Like,
Right.
there's something I think about expectation that really sours what something's going to be. I remember doing, I started a sort of fledgling modernist book club that promptly failed because students are very busy. But I remember reading The Waves, and my buddy comes in talking about the waves, and he's making all these associations right off the bat to like
Yeah.
prior things. Um, but it's all about this because he's heard of Joyce, who was about modernism. He's like, oh, it's going to be hyper referential. Turns out it's not incredibly like referential. It's pretty referential, but if you just understand the core of like what's actually on the page, you're fine. And it's
Yep.
like we layer all these expectations onto a piece of literature that if we just go in and we just find what's interesting to us and we just sort of find some curiosity about it and nurture that curiosity as best we can, that'll actually get us a long way in terms of interpreting a poem, but also just liking stuff.
100%. I agree with you 100%. I have my copy of The Waves where when I read it, I realized about 50 pages in, I needed to start over because I wanted to try and like make a sense of the different voices. Like I was like, I'm reading this too quickly and the voices are blending together. And like Bernard and Ginny, I think it was, had voices that were sort of divergent. I could spot them. I was like, okay. So I took a colored pencil and was like drawing down the margin of the page. I had a color code of like blue was for Bernard, like the bees, and orange is for Neville and things like that. So that I could I could look and I would have a quick reference of like, this is the voice, I should be like trying to connect these voices and seeing how they are different in subtle ways. And it's sort of like a puzzle box. Sometimes books can be fun when they're puzzle boxes and there's some way to interact with them that's not just at the level of the story or emotion and empathy, but there's something else that requires us to think and bring our brains to the task at hand.
Exactly, and there's something about even The Waves is a really good example of this actually, because one of the things we did, um, because I noticed like it's a really tough work to just approach with
Mhm.
nothing there. So the first time we met about it, I asked people, I was like, "Who are your favorite characters?" Okay, you like Rhoda a lot. How about you just like think about Rhoda? Like that could be your sort of main focus for the discussion. And the person was like, "Hell yes, I would love to think about Rhoda more." Like that's it. And we each gave each other a couple voices to sort of track, and that helped a lot. Be like any recurring images in your thing, and the girl goes like, yeah, Rhoda's always talking about uncertainty. There's always vagueness. What's up with this? Does it relate to anything with your guys' characters? And I'm just like, oh, well, I don't know. Ginny's always about light, for example. That's been really
Mhm.
interesting to me. And people will sort of say, oh, well, I noticed this with Ginny. And then
Mhm.
it sort of helps me think about it. It's something, finding some kind of focus is really good for igniting that curiosity too, is the gist of that. But
No, I agree entirely. And I like that you brought up the waves because not just because I happen to be personally leading a very small like reading group at my school of seniors who are sort of they're de-stressed at this point, and I said let's pick up something that's really challenging. Mind you, these are students who I have in like multivariable calculus and differential equations. I'm like, you need
yeah,
to lower your anxiety, so let's read something that's really different and weird. It's going to challenge you in a different way. And so we started it on Monday, and we're having conversations about it this week, kind of at lunch or when we have time in class, and we're going to finish it
cool.
next week. And they're all, as you said, bringing something interesting to it. But it made me sort of think of this idea of like, did you have are there works thinking specifically of confusion, and that it's okay to not get a work the first time, it's okay to not appreciate everything on a first reading? Are there books or reading experiences you have where you maybe didn't enjoy it the first time you read it, but there was something in there that sort of like stuck in you, it like hooked in you in some part of your mind or your heart, and it drew you back in? You didn't enjoy the experience the first time, and there might have been a context around it, but you came back to it and you're like, I need to come back to that. I need to reapproach it. I need to try it again. Have you ever had that experience?
To be honest, not very much. Most of the stuff that I've returned to and wanted to get more of was the stuff that I like, stuff like Gravity's Rainbow and The Sound and the Fury. When I first read both of those, I was like, "There's something here. I have no idea what it is." I'd read them at a point where I barely knew what like modernism was,
Right.
let alone postmodernism. So I'm going into them, and it's just this sort of flurry. I feel like I'm just getting beat over the head with a bunch of times. But I ended up sort of really appreciating like the breakneck sort of the pace and the jaggedness of some of Gravity's Rainbow. I was fascinated by it. The Sound and the Fury, there's just some gorgeous writing, especially in Benji's section, which I made it to the end of without getting a single thing except for like the smell of trees and stuff like that. And I was just like, I love this. What's up with this? And then when I read both of those again, I actually ended up appreciating them. Um, Other things I didn't like at first, like Sir Gawain, I was forced to reread them for school. And I've since read Gawain. Every time I've read it, it's been for school. And I've read it, I think, 4 times. And every time I go back, I like it more and more and more. It's what I thought was just really stupid, baggy. Oh, everything's perfect. Everything's the best. Everything's the richest. You thought this person was wearing the nicest clothing? Well, the next person is wearing better clothing. It's like, like I was so frustrated with that. But after sort of learning more about it, there's not much filler. And I'm really able to appreciate it just far more than I ever really did after read number 4. So there's stuff like that, but I wasn't actively seeking that out. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think for me, a lot of it, as I was thinking about the books that I didn't fully get the first time I read them, sometimes I remember being frustrated because I remember thinking I was really smart, and then it was somehow a failure of my mind to not get some work. And honestly, sometimes it's just I didn't like the person who exposed it to me. So I remember I read
Same.
I read Blood Meridian my first year at a university when I was 18, and the college professor, he was very aggressive. He was incredibly aggressive towards us. At one point, he like wrote in my feedback about like, "You're a really arrogant bastard, but at least you're honest." And I was like, "What? Like, did you just say
Jesus.
that to me?"
Like
And
I
he
didn't know
gave me
that
like a
was
98 out of 100. And I was like, "Well, I'm not going to argue."
but
I
my
was like,
God.
insult me, but give me the good grade. But I remember feeling in my mind of like, this guy's a jerk. Like he's a jerk, and anything he likes, he's such a jerk that anything he likes must just not be very good. And everybody else was reading like Gothic literature or whatever
Oh yeah.
for that sort of freshman introductory English class, and we're reading Blood Meridian and talking about violence and the beauty of violence. And it's ridiculous at times. He was like, oh, we really good. And we're of course in a locale where part of the book is set there. So we can really appreciate the setting and stuff. But like, this is ridiculous. But I remember thinking about the book and being like, I've never read anything like that. And being like, that book sucked. Like, I hated it. But I didn't hate the book. I just hated the guy who exposed it to me. And I reread it at the end of college. Right? I was kind of packing up my stuff because I was going to be leaving and I was graduating, and I came across that. And so I'd finished a lot of my exams, and I sat down and I reread a couple of books that I had read in college. I was like, I hadn't thought about this in a couple of years. And I read it and I was like, this is really good. I was like, this really speaks to me now.
After his shadow has left the reading experience.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I'm not constantly arguing with the guy who biked here and then ripped into all of us about our discussion board posts. But I also thought of A Doll's House, because I read this, and again, it was like I think I was 16 or 17, and I just couldn't stand the teacher in the class. I was 16 turning 17 at the end of that year, and I couldn't stand the teacher in the class. And I would say I was really arrogant, but I would say things like, oh, like I'm gonna get that teacher to retire by the time I graduate from high school. So I was like, I'm gonna write a few essays. I'm gonna push the envelope just enough that teacher's gonna decide to retire by the time I leave.
You sound like a pleasure.
Yeah, I probably, the context of teaching that book probably made the other people hate it too.
Yeah.
But I just remember going through life thinking like, Ibsen's awful. Like I don't want to approach Ibsen. Like The Doll's House is terrible. And I had read The Wild Duck, and I didn't like that either. And I was like, this guy, there's nothing, he has no merit. And I ended up reading just one of his smaller plays, A Public Enemy, or An Enemy of the People, and being like, oh, this was kind of different, and realizing like, oh, that was based. And so I got into reading more Ibsen, and now I read one of his plays. It feels like every year I sit down and read one of his plays, and I'm like, I'm going to have to reread A Doll's House, because it's probably actually really good. And I was just an arrogant teenager who was a jerk and didn't like the adult introducing me to the book.
Yeah, we sometimes forget how much the way a book comes into our life affects what we think about it. I've definitely like read books with people and just not enjoyed it too. Like, and then I'm wondering if Henry James is like that for me in particular, with some people that I've talked about Turn of the Screw with, but I don't think so. I don't know. Anyways, but it's yeah, you're definitely onto something with that.
Yeah. And the other one I thought of was a book that I was not taught, but it was Dante. And I remember reading Dante and thinking, this is terrible. Like, this is legitimately awful. It's just a catalog of everybody the guy doesn't like, and he's working out his antipathy and punishing them in his fiction. And I had read it twice. I had read it when I was younger. I read it again in my mid-20s and was like, nope, I was right. Dante's, because I read it in my later 20s because we were going on a trip to Italy, my wife and I, for our second anniversary. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna reread Dante. I'm gonna be ready for when we go to Florence. And I remember finishing it and just like powering through it, being like, this is terrible. And I don't want to picture outside of the street where he was born. I don't want to see the copy of his Bible at the academy where the David is. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with Dante. And then in my 30s, I read this other translation by Lawrence Binion, and I was like blown away, and I loved it. And I felt so bad. I was like, oh my gosh, if you're going to read Dante, let me recommend this translation. And there was just something where I was like, maybe I am wrong. Maybe Dante is worth paying attention to.
Maybe Dante is worth liking. That's a good one. I don't know.
And I have one friend I still talk to consistently from elementary school, from grade school, and he's an English teacher. I teach math. He teaches English at a school out on the west side of Phoenix, but we'll message each other periodically. And he and I were talking, and I said, what's your favorite part of the comedy now that we're, after we're in our later 30s? He was like, oh, definitely the purgatory. I said, me too. I said, do you think it's because we're getting older? He goes, definitely. I said, how old do you think we'll have to be when we start to think that the paradiso is the best part of the comedy? And
Maybe you'll be there by then.
Yeah, we started talking about that. And I thought, like, I don't know. I was like, maybe like I have to be a grandparent. Maybe I'll have to, like, my father passed away years ago, but I thought maybe it's like not having anyone in your family who's sort of, like you're now the oldest generation in your family. And I was like, there's got to be something in life that's going to happen where I'm going to feel like, oh, the paradiso really clicks for me now. So I hope to get
Oh,
that.
that makes sense.
But we'll see. Maybe I'll never reach that point. Thinking about the idea of there being works that we know are difficult or we're told are difficult. Did you ever feel like you had to train for a work? So I think of.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Like the way I'm interpreting it, like I think a lot of times when you find these new authors and we think, oh, Pynchon, Joyce, you start, okay, what's the thing they've written with the lowest page count? I think that's a form of training. That's sort of what you mean by it?
That can definitely be what you mean by it.
Yeah. So with Joyce, I was like, okay, short stories. We're starting with short stories. Dubliners, read that twice. Moved on to portrait, endured portrait for a little while. And then I took a course on Ulysses, which is a great sort of ground zero for this whole discussion. The stories I could tell about that. But we read portrait for the first week or two, and then we went on to Ulysses. So it's like even the professor in that was sort of trying to train us on what he's doing, the techniques he's using, because they're quite different from some of the other courses, the stuff that was assigned in other courses. So yeah, I've definitely trained. Approaching parallel stories by Peter Nadash, I spent much more time learning about the Hungarian Revolution, I think like 1956 or something, than I spent reading the book. And of course, I didn't finish the book. So, right, absolutely, I've trained. You've probably trained? I mean, we've all done it, I think. Yeah.
That was the one where I was like, I remember thinking, okay, like this James Joyce guy, and the way I was exposed to literature was very haphazard. I would hear a reference in a movie and be like, oh, and I this is pre-iPhone, so I would have like post-it notes I would write down, or I would have a notebook and I would have these jottings. I had the notebook in college that I took the fewest notes in for having to be a psychology notebook. No shade, absolutely no shade. I just by far took the fewest notes in that class. So I had all this extra paper, and so I started making these lists in there. That became where I would just store lists of books I wanted to read or movies I wanted to watch, and then I would sort of write a bunch on a post-it note if I was going into a used bookstore or a used record store to maybe pick up a DVD or something, and I would have this post-it note I would look through and scan. But I remember hearing about Joyce and having a teacher when I was 15 tell me like, Joyce is just terrible. Like there's no point. I know Ulysses is number one on some lists, but he's terrible. I hate James Joyce. I was like, okay, like cool, like respect. And just kind of thinking, okay. And then later on having people be like, oh no, James Joyce. I was like, okay, all right. So I read Dubliners. I was like, some of these are pretty good. And then I remember reading A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and being like, okay, like I'm supposed to think this is amazing. So I will find a way to make. I actually regret in being like 22 and telling my youngest brother's friends like, hey, if you want to be a real reader, you got to try this Portrait of the Artist. Like, it's one of my deep regrets. They ask like, what would you tell yourself if you could go back and younger? Like, don't ever recommend that book to people. I probably turned off at least half a dozen future readers by recommending that book. But I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to read Ulysses. So I was like, I got to reread the Odyssey. Got to reread the Odyssey and really get into it and spend time with it. And then you'll be okay to go after Joyce. And then getting to that chapter where he starts with like Old English and then shifts to Middle English and
Oxen of the Sun.
yeah. And feeling like as I was getting into it, like I got to go back and read the Penguin Classics, Anglo-Saxon poetry edition, and I got to reread a couple of tales from Chaucer before the Middle English and Shakespeare, and trying to like keep myself going through that. And I was loving it, but I kept thinking like this is like a triathlon. What did I get myself into?
That's so fascinating too, because even like I remember the course I took on Ulysses. I had a really good entry point because one of our assignments for my assignment was due on Oxen of the Sun. I did a presentation, and our professor said, do a biography of a word in Ulysses
Mm.
up to the chapter that it's mentioned. And my word was gentleman. But Oxen of the Sun was like it was the cutoff chapter for me. So I actually had a really cool lens into the chapter. We're talking
Yeah.
about ways of like um, sort of navigating confusion. I was just looking at a single word as it was produced in the chapter and when it was produced in the chapter and all the chapters before. So I was tracking all these cool lexical shifts. But the other students who weren't presenting and were mostly done their presentations had like mortal terror. They said, "What the hell was this? This isn't even English. Like, is this a book? Like, I don't understand." And then obviously a bunch of everyone's, hoping James Joyce someday dies and stuff like that. But it's like, it's just, I don't know. I understand like where you had that sort of like lighting your brain on fire feeling where, oh my God, there's so many connections to be made. There's like just absolutely abject, like readerly humiliation and shame at this chapter too. So I don't know. It's kind of a great example.
Yeah. I think of as well Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco. Because I read The Name of the Rose when I was like a teenager in college. I loved it. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And so my grandparents had a copy of Foucault's Pendulum. And I thought, like, this guy was great. And I read the dust jacket and I'm like, oh, it's conspiracies and weird symbolism. Great. That guy was an amazing writer. And I read about the first 30 pages. I was like, Jesus, this is dense. Like, and I think I was like 20 or 21. I was like, I'm not ready for this. And then my grandmother had passed away right after I graduated from college. And so I was staying with my grandfather at night at their house because he was in his mid 80s at that point. And so we were kind of, I had the most free time as I was job searching. So I was staying with him at night. And I remember going into their library and being like, oh yeah, Foucault's Pendulum. It's like, you know what? I've got all this time. I'm ready. I'm going to start it again. And I started, and I was like, I failed. I was like, I was not very good at that. And it wasn't until I was 34 that I was able to actually read the book and like get into it and just go, you know what? Like, let's do this. I've read a lot of stuff in the intervening decades since I last failed on this. I let's go for it. And if I fail, you know what? Big deal. I'm
Yeah.
not reading to prove anything to anybody anymore. So let's just have at it and see what happens. And there was a guy on BookTube, Jason Harrigan, who had organized this reading in 2020. And I just jumped in and kept up. And I thought, well, this is good. He was making videos, but I would do the reading and then I would watch his video afterwards. I was like pushing myself, like, I'm not going to walk into this video and have, be told what to think about it. I'm going to do the reading and then I'll go watch the video and learn significantly more than I picked up. But I really dug it. And it kind of reminds me, like, it's okay to not get the book right away. There's nothing wrong with that. We're pushed so much to this idea of there's an answer, there's an interpretation. And I think part of that, honestly, in European culture, North American culture, a lot of that is driven by like Judeo-Christian doctrinal theology. Like we read literature closely because for centuries people read spiritual literature very, very closely and had life or death decisions based on that. And some people still do. And that was part of my upbringing, was sitting down and reading the Bible extraordinarily closely and then having heavy duty discussions about like, well, what does this actually mean? And like, you're making a significant choice about this. And so there is the like reading and interpretation in a large part stems for generations from that. We're finally, I think, getting away from that like fear of there is a correct reading. You better get it, because if you don't, everything is lost. And that approach was, I think, taken into literature in the 19th century and the 20th century and in the 21st century. And I see it shifting, but I think that's a big part of where it drives from.
No, I think you're totally right about that. It's really, really interesting, especially the stakes that are sort of put into a piece of literature when you're approaching it like that. There is sort of a lot at stake, especially in a, and no one wants to seem stupid or feel stupid, So like oftentimes there our egos are in the back, just sort of making sure like, hey, you better not like this if you don't get it. Like you better find a reason that this is somehow bad instead of, it being your fault. Um, but yeah, there's this thing though. It's like that's a way of reading that's very like, you have to focus in on everything and read really closely. But I feel like one of the issues, at least now, is just reading purely for the sake of like, okay, what's literally on the page. I mean, when I was learning to read, I remember doing quizzes on Treasure Island. This is like grade eight. I think to be honest, I think I was past this in grade eight. Um, but we'd get a 5 question quiz and it would be all basic plot points. Who was Long John Silver talking to on XYZ? And I was just like, eh, I don't know. I think reading, I love Treasure Island. I really enjoyed the book. But
Yeah.
I still enjoy it because I have those memories. But I think you can't approach many books like that in terms of like the greater literary ones. And I think it's sort of like there is a kind of damage that does to readers when you're purely looking for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. There's definitely the frustration from some of my colleagues when they ask students questions like, what color was the horse? They're like, it's straight out of the text. It's like, yeah, but are you respecting the students' minds when you ask that question?
And who cares?
Like, it's at such a low level that it's basically like that question is not requiring you to think. It's basically testing two things. One, did you actually read this story? And two, do you have a basic level of literacy? That's all it's asking. It's not asking
Yeah.
you to connect or think or do anything. It's just it's straight out of the text. If they can't get that, I don't know what's wrong with them. I'm like, we I respect them as thinkers.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I was trying to think about something, but it's a little late and I'm gapping it right now. But yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, do you have? I know it's late for you. I
Oh, it's all
apologize,
good. I don't care.
but
It's
I
fine.
appreciate you joining for this. Um, do you have any works or books that you sort of know when you open them up, you know you're going to be baffled, and that you sort of are like, yeah, this was a bad idea. This was running a 10K after I ate a big burrito or something.
Absolutely. There's like I love the Finnegans Wake group at school. It's like some people that's their therapy, and if that helps you, that helps you.
Yeah.
But I found it incredibly exhausting, especially during exam season. I'd go there and it was run by a really, really smart and cool prof, but chasing all of the little picture, like, okay, well, why would he say, um, I don't know, like any little tiny turn of phrase, like why would he put these two words together? And then by the time you zoom out, you're like, okay, well, what about what happened chapter before, like the not the chapter before, but like the paragraph or two before? We were talking about what Anne Olivia Pluribel was wearing, and now we're here. What's the relation? You know, and we'd lose that a lot of the time. So I found it just an incredibly taxing experience. Although there are occasional moments that I was just, I was really revitalized by it.
Yeah. I read Finnegans Wake during the late pandemic in 2021 when I had moved to a new school. It felt like Lord of the Flies at times. I would say that in leadership meetings. I'd be like, we currently have a malevolent anarchy, and we need to at least get to being a benevolent anarchy in the next quarter. Like this is an actual problem. Like there are dangerous things happen, like dangerous norms being set for our students if we don't address these things and like take it very seriously. And my wife was working as a travel nurse, and so all this was going on, and my daughters were my younger daughter had just started preschool, and my older daughter was in kindergarten and had come back to school from the pandemic. And so I was so stressed out. It was the only time I ever seriously looked like at applying, for a job teaching online or something. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do to make it through this. I was so overwhelmed. There were no substitutes. Like we couldn't get substitutes. So I was covering classes nonstop. Like whenever I had a planning period, I was covering classes during lunch. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to be in here for the first 35 minutes. And then the dean of students will come in and take the final 25 minutes of the class. And so I would do that like 3 days a week. And I was just so burned out. And so I took Finnegans Wake and I just started reading it out loud one evening. And I joked, I said, it's basically Dr. Seuss for adults at a very reductive level. It can be that. It's more than that, but it can be that.
Yeah.
And I said, if I find one joke that I get, one joke in reference or pun or something on every page, I'm good to go. And that was how I read it. And I started to really it was so intense that I was like, okay, I'm not going to get all of this. I don't even need to try. I should just turn it into a little scavenger hunt for jokes. And I would just read it every evening, and at maybe 10 pages, maybe 20 pages, maybe 40 pages. And I would just find like my anxiety was coming down. Everything was lowering because I couldn't think about the world while I was hunting for jokes in the language. And it made me start, I don't know. I fell in love with reading in a different way, where I had always gone out running to relax, and I couldn't do that because it would involve someone else coming and staying with my daughters because my wife wasn't at home. And so there was this whole thing of trying to figure out how else can I relax in some new way. And it was, okay, I'm going to read this incredibly bizarre and dense book and not worry about it. Just accept that I'm not going to get everything and see if I enjoy that. And I did. I was like, I'm going to have to reread this one day.
And I imagine you ended up preferring it, reading it like that, than if you were to really get it, because like, say what you will, like incredibly Joyce will insert some like intentionally stupid stuff into that, and like it's 628 pages, the whole 2 pi thing.
Yep.
Like he could cut stuff if he wants. I know people might not like me saying that, but like I don't know, it's more enjoyable to read it and just say, I'm gonna pull from this book anything I'd like to really pull from this, rather than understand the nuances of every single thing.
And I think sometimes we build up this pressure around reading that there's this deeper purpose to it, because many times there's a purpose of learning. And there's that idea of like, there's a point in our lives, and this is something my daughters have sort of been grasping, when knowledge becomes really exciting. And it becomes like palpably exciting. There's that idea where as we learn new words, or as we learn how to do things, like how to cook some basic meal for ourselves, or how to tie our shoes, so we don't have to stop when our shoe comes untied. We can just tie it ourselves and then get up and run again. And there's something that's really exciting about knowledge. And then at some point it starts to feel the acquisition of knowledge starts to feel a little bit like homework. It's an assignment, and it's not fun anymore. It's duty. It's a duty that we have to do. And you almost have to make it through that to get to this idea of like, knowledge is actually exciting. Like it's fun to make associations and connections. And we can read for that, or we can read to develop our emotions and the way that we approach other people and their circumstances and conditions. I know reading books from, especially like not just African literature, but literature by African women, I learned so much, because that wasn't something I could personally go and experience in any way, but I could learn about how, like, what is in that author's mind as she's having these experiences. You know, how is she sharing of her life in these pages, so I can have some level of understanding and empathy. I can't have complete understanding because I'm not going to live through that, but I can appreciate, you know, her story and where she's come from. So we do that, but also it's okay to read without those super didactic purposes.
Yeah, or again, I think a lot of it just comes down to like igniting your own curiosity. You know, if you treat reading and obtaining knowledge, I don't if you treat all that stuff like play, it becomes very different, your experience of it. You like when you play, the ego doesn't really get involved a lot of times. You're just having fun and you're discovering and you find what you're finding. And there's something about that that's incredibly liberating when you approach a different piece of work. And it's not just about like having fun with the words on the page. There's a lot of things that I've read that I'm like, I don't like the prose too. I'm just like, I find it kind of unfun to read. But when I think about it, I'm learning new things. I'm putting pieces together, and I really like the intellectual games and what that book leaves me in terms of like other people's experiences, general knowledge. You know, um, I hope that approximates an answer.
No, I think you're getting at something there. But yeah, so thanks for joining for this. Do you have any final thoughts beyond, you know, I think we're both going to keep being questing readers.
No, I love that, the idea of being questing readers, but I also, you know, a lot of the stuff about difficulty and ego comes from readers who want to sort of be, you know, deeper readers a lot of the time.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's just worth noting that like being in academia now, the difference between like people who like what they study and people who don't is the people who approach what they study with that sense of like fun and play and curiosity. You know, people run a Joyce panel on what they don't understand in Ulysses, you know, which is a very different approach than the person that has to understand everything, I guess. I knew somebody who wrote an awesome essay just on the footnotes in The Wasteland.
Hmm.
He's like, I don't want to talk about the poem. I don't care about what the poem means. I just want to talk about the footnotes. So he does that. And that's for him a helpful lens in. And
Mhm.
that was how he started liking The Wasteland, which is seems bizarre to me, but you know, different strokes for different folks. Um, yeah, I don't know. When you play, you don't have to worry about authority figures too telling you what the best focus is for you. So
Right.
go find it.
Yeah, I think that's it. Go find it. So thank you again, Quentin, for joining. I really do appreciate your thoughts and the attitude you bring. You have such a you have a humane sensibility.
I appreciate that.
And I think we all need that. I need more of that in my own attitudes in life, and so I try to uh, you know, keep pushing in that direction as a reader, as a person, as a parent, as a thinker, just as a concerned human.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It was a lot of fun to talk about this, so
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Well, let us know in the comments. Are there works that challenged you? Are there works that you despised when you first read them and then got hooked, but drawn back into that web of words? Are there works that you are terrified of and are putting off? Because I know I've sat and looked at parallel stories multiple times and just been like, yeah, not in the mood for that. Summer
Yeah.
project.
Yeah, I think we actually talked about reading it before, and
We
neither
did.
of us wanted to.
I was like, I think I'm gonna. I have a couple of students who have bandied about reading either because they're going to graduate, reading either Gravity's Rainbow or Infinite Jest this summer, or Middlemarch, and I'm like, okay, like I might be open to doing a little book group on any one of these. You guys, let me know.
Yeah, you can make those plans pretty confidently saying, you know, I'm gonna have a lot of time in the summer.
Yeah. Well, I like to think of it sometimes as having someone to sort of spot you while you're weightlifting. There's an accountability
Mhm.
piece. And then I also am just like, yeah, I am also, you know, an adult with kids and responsibilities and a mortgage. And so sometimes I'm just bailing.
That's
So
totally fine. I think you did that with Genji too, by the way.
I've definitely been,
Not that I'm pointing fingers.
I'm an inveterate bailer. I'll point them all at myself right now.
It's all good. It's all good. I think I was the
Yeah,
only one that made it through that, but I don't know.
it's sitting there. I know I'll read it one day. I just gotta have the motivation. I think was that in 2022?
2, I think. Like, that was a
Yeah,
while ago now.
that was the year we remodeled the house. That was a rough year. That was
Yeah, yeah.
that was a really rough. We were living in another house, and at one point in August, I was driving. It was taking me 80 minutes to get from my mom's house to work because I would drive to my older daughter's school and drop her off at her bus stop. And then I had to drive past my work, 15 minutes past my work to a daycare to drop our younger daughter off. And then I would drive to work and I would arrive 5 minutes before the bell rang. And so if there were if there was anybody who was out or anything, I would have to be furiously, they would be text messaging me like, so and so is not covered, and be like, I will be there. Someone open the door and let the students in. I will cover first period. And it got to the point where I was like, I'm basically not going to read anything. I'm going to read a poem every night, and then I'm going to fall asleep and be exhausted. So,
Yeah,
but I'll
totally
get to
fine.
Genji. Maybe I can convince them to do Genji instead of Infinite Jest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Good
But
luck.
thank you again, Quentin. I really do appreciate it. And like I said, I appreciate your thoughts. I appreciate your attitude and the reader you are and the person you are. So
Well,
have a
thanks a
good one.
lot.
All right. Farewell, BookTube. Soon to
Peace and
return.
groovy.